It was a mild spring morning in St. Mary Mead, the sort that coaxed daffodils to rise with shy enthusiasm and set the village abuzz with quiet industry. In her modest but well-tended cottage garden, Miss Jane Marple bent carefully over a stubborn rosebush, her gloved fingers adjusting a climbing stem with the same delicacy one might use to lace a corset. To the casual observer, she might have seemed simply another genteel elderly lady in a village full of them. But those who knew her well, few dared claim that honor fully, were aware that behind her soft voice and genteel manner resided a mind both sharp and quietly relentless. Birdsong laced the air, and the distant chime of the church bell reminded her it was 10:30. She straightened, brushing a bit of soil from her cardigan, and glanced toward the hedge bordering the back of her garden. A robin flitted by. A cat yawned lazily on the stone wall. All was as it should be. Yet even in such peaceful hours Miss Marple never truly ceased observing. And it was just as well, for that morning would mark the beginning of a most peculiar chain of events. It was perhaps 10 minutes later when she saw him. A man, tall perhaps in his 50s, stood near the far hedge of her garden, partially obscured by the hawthorn branches. He wore a gray overcoat, buttoned neatly despite the warmth, and a dark hat that shadowed most of his face. At first she thought he might be lost or perhaps admiring the tulips, but there was something disquieting in his stillness. He was not observing the flowers. He was staring at the house, more precisely, at the window of her sitting room. Miss Marple blinked, then called out, "Can I help you?" The man gave no answer. She began walking slowly toward him, her voice calm, but firm. "You must have come through the side gate. It is usually closed." But before she reached the midpoint of the lawn, the man turned, suddenly, almost too smoothly, and disappeared behind the hedge. By the time she reached the boundary, he was gone. No footsteps on the gravel path, no creak of a gate, as though he had never been there at all. Miss Marple remained quite still, hands clasped, her eyes narrowed. "Curious," she murmured, "very curious indeed." It was not until much later that the pieces began to fall into place. Just after tea, Reverend Phelps arrived, looking rather more flustered than usual. His spectacles were slightly askew, and his voice bore a tremor as he stood awkwardly in Miss Marple's drawing room, hat clutched to his chest. I thought I should tell you myself, Miss Marple." She looked up from her embroidery, her tone as calm as ever. "Tell me what, Reverend?" "There's been a discovery behind the church, in the far corner near the yew trees." He paused. "A body? A man, I'm afraid. Dead." Her fingers froze mid-stitch. "They think he may have taken ill or something else. The police are on their way." "Did anyone recognize him?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "No one from the village, but Miss Marple. He was described as being tall, gray coat, dark hat." "I see." She folded her embroidery carefully, setting it aside. "Then I imagine," she said with a quiet firmness, "that I have seen him too. Only this morning, in my garden." The police came that evening. A sergeant drew from Much Benham, polite and slightly wary in her presence. He asked the usual questions. Had she spoken to the man? Had he left anything behind? "No," Miss Marple replied, but he stared, quite intently. It was unsettling. The man's belongings yielded little: a pocket watch, a ticket from Paddington to Much Benham, a well-worn wallet with no money, no identification, and, curiously, no initials or monogram. But it was the final item that caused the sergeant's brow to furrow. From the inside of the man's coat, tucked into a stitched fold near the lining, They retrieved an old photograph. Sergeant Drew passed it silently to Miss Marple. It was sepia-toned, edges frayed with time. A young woman stood in a summer garden, smiling faintly, parasol in hand. The resemblance was unmistakable. Miss Marple's lips parted, but she said nothing for a moment. "This was taken," she said finally, "in 1904, I believe, at my cousin Lydia's house in Suffolk. Then the girl is myself," she said simply. The sergeant said nothing, but the implication hung heavy between them. Why would a man she did not know carry an old photograph of her, hidden and folded with such care? The arrival of a body in a place as peaceful as St. Mary Mead was bound to ripple through the community. Though nothing was yet said aloud in the Blue Boar or the post office, Miss Marple knew the village mind was already hard at work, speculating, stitching together half-truths, drawing conclusions with alarming speed and little evidence. She herself, however, preferred to catalogue quietly. There was Miss Diana Stone, the artist who had taken the cottage next to the vicarage, reclusive, polite, and prone to painting well past midnight. She claimed to seek tranquility, though her eyes suggested past storms. Then there was Major Harold Finch, retired from somewhere in India, always gruff and red-faced, prone to loud judgments about youth, gardening, and foreigners. He had been seen pacing near the churchyard only days ago. And Polly Griggs, the vicar's new maid, barely 20, all ears and wide eyes, with a habit of appearing just where she wasn't meant to be. 3 newcomers, all curious in their way. Miss Marple, teacup in hand, pondered the landscape of her village as one might a game board. Murder had no place in St. Mary Mead. And yet, somehow, it had arrived. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlor, the photograph beside her, the fire burning low. She reviewed the day's events in the privacy of her mind, each moment gently polished, examined, and filed. She recalled the man in her garden, how still he had stood. His coat had been buttoned to the collar despite the warmth, his hat low over his brow. She remembered his boots, caked with a particular type of mud, not the crumbly dry earth of her rose beds, but something darker, stickier. Not the sort one would pick up strolling through St. Mary Mead on a dry morning. And yet, his hands had been immaculate, no dirt beneath the nails, no tremor in their stillness. She reached again for the photograph, herself at 19, unguarded and unaware. Why would he have carried such a thing? And what brought him to her garden after all these years? The official inquiry would surely focus on strangers, on medical reports, on alibis and identifications. But Miss Marple knew better. The answers were not always in what people said, but in what they didn't, in their habits, their shame, their silences. And already, she suspected, this was no accident. Inspector Crail was not the sort of man who took comfort in teacups or antimacassars. Yet Miss Marple offered both, as he settled awkwardly in the lace-trimmed armchair of her sitting room. He was a tall man, with a grave brow, and an expression of perpetual suspicion, as if even the wallpaper might be withholding key evidence. "I understand, madam, that you saw the deceased earlier that same morning," he said, laying his notebook flat on his knee. "I did," Miss Marple replied serenely, stirring her tea with slow precision. "Briefly, he was standing in the far corner of my garden. When I called out to him, he disappeared through the hedge." Crail's eyes flicked to the photograph, which now lay on the table between them, its sepia tones faded by time. "And you're quite certain this is you in the photograph, found on his person?" "Quite certain," she said. "It was taken when I was a girl, 19, perhaps 20. A summer house party in Suffolk. I had nearly forgotten it existed. Crail frowned. And yet he carried it, folded into the lining of his coat. Yes, she replied quietly. One imagines it meant more to him than to me. Would you say you knew him? I have no recollection, she said honestly. But that, Inspector, doesn't mean he did not know me. Crail tapped his pen. If there's anything else you remember, no matter how small, do let us know. I shall, said Miss Marple, rising to see him out. But I find, Inspector, that the smallest things are often not so small after all. The next morning Miss Marple rose early, donned her most sensible shoes, and set off for a quiet stroll toward the railway station. She told no one, not even her maid Cherry, of her intention. It was not secrecy, precisely, only that Miss Marple had found it most effective to keep her thoughts to herself, until she had collected enough of them to be worth sharing. The ticket clock at the station was a young man named Bertie, eager, red-cheeked, and most usefully, talkative. Miss Marple greeted him with a smile that conveyed both grandmotherly warmth and subtle expectation. "Oh yes, miss," he said when she inquired after any recent strangers. "One gentleman came through 2 days ago, bought a return from Paddington, asked for directions to the vicarage, but never returned his stub." "Did he say whom he meant to visit?" "No, miss. But he asked whether the churchyard was still open to the public. Bit odd, that." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And you remember what he looked like?" "Middle-aged, clean coat, very formal, had a cane with a silver top." "A silver-topped cane," she echoed. "How distinctive." She left the station with her thoughts stirring like a spoon in warm tea. It was all beginning to take a certain shape, not yet formed, but no longer entirely formless. It seemed the gentleman had come to St. Mary Mead with intention. And intention, in Miss Marple's long experience, was rarely innocent. Miss Marple's next visit was to the small cottage beside the vicarage, where Miss Diana Stone had taken up residence in early spring. She was a quiet tenant, the vicar had said, kept mostly to herself, and painted for hours on end. The woman who answered the door was pale, with dark, alert eyes, and the sort of beauty that seemed carved from years of restraint. Her hands were stained faintly with ochre and ultramarine. She invited Miss Marple in with polite reserve, offering tea and apologizing for the clutter of her studio. Miss Marple's gaze wandered with the casual precision of one trained in a lifetime of quiet observation. Paintings leaned against the walls, landscapes, still lifes, a half-finished portrait of a child with a solemn expression. But it was a canvas tucked behind an easel that caught her attention. She moved toward it slowly. The subject was a man, gray coat, strong brow, silver-topped cane resting beside his chair. His face was unfinished, yet the resemblance to the man in her garden was undeniable. "A striking piece," Miss Marple said gently. Diana's hand stiffened around her teacup. "Oh, that! It's only a study. I paint faces from memory sometimes." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's tone remained light. "I often find memories come uninvited, especially those one would rather forget." "I didn't know him," Diana said quickly. "If that's what you're suggesting." Miss Marple smiled. "My dear, I rarely suggest. I observe. And then, if I am very lucky, I remember." Diana said nothing more, but the faint flush on her cheek told Miss Marple that the memory, though unspoken, was not absent. Major Harold Finch was not a man known for his patience, and certainly not for subtlety. When Miss Marple encountered him at the church gate, muttering to himself while glaring at the small crowd near the vicarage, he looked as though someone had personally offended his honor. "Disgraceful business," he huffed, doffing his cap without warmth. Her dead man in the churchyard. What's the world coming to? I dare say death has always paid its respects here, Major. Miss Marple replied mildly, though usually in a more scheduled fashion. He gave a gruff chuckle but turned tense when she added, rather near your family plot, I believe. His eyes narrowed. Yes, the west corner. Been Finchland since 1791. My great-uncle George is buried there. Then you must be quite familiar with that part of the grounds. Of course I am. Why? Only, she said softly, the body was found mere feet from your family stone. I wondered if you'd noticed anyone loitering there recently. He bristled. Are you suggesting I was involved, Miss Marple? Not at all, Major. She smiled. Merely that you might have seen something. People often do, without realizing its importance. He made a vague sound of disapproval, muttered something about idle gossip, and stalked away. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression unreadable. For all his bravado, Major Finch had looked quite unsettled, as though the corpse had not merely arrived, but returned. It was in the dim hush of the parish kitchen that Polly Griggs spoke up. Hot whisper, hot confession. She had been polishing the brass candlesticks when Miss Marple stopped in to bring the vicar some pressed lavender sachets. You ought to know something, miss, Polly said, glancing about nervously. 'Twas the night before the police came. I saw someone. Miss Marple paused. Go on, dear. I couldn't sleep. The wind was tapping the shutter and I came down for milk. That's when I saw it, light in the study. Thought the vicar had left the lamp on, but then I saw a shadow. Someone moving. In the study? Polly nodded. Tall. Stood near the desk. Didn't switch anything on, just stood. Then I heard the floorboard creak, and he was gone. Did you see his face? No, miss, just the shape. A coat, I think. Long. Did you tell the vicar? Oh, no, miss. Thought it might have been him at first. But next day when the body was found, I knew it weren't right. Miss Marple touched the girl's hand lightly. You were very wise to tell me. For in Polly's timid confession, Miss Marple heard something vital. The dead man had come not only to observe, but to search, and he had done so, in the dark. That evening Miss Marple reviewed the inspector's report once more. It mentioned the man's boots, caked with dark soil, and a peculiar scuffing on the heels. Nothing else had seemed unusual. But Miss Marple had spent nearly every day in her garden, and she knew St. Mary Mead's soil intimately. The graveyard soil was sandy, pale, her own garden, chalky and dry. But the mud on that man's boots, as she recalled from her brief glance, had been deep brown, almost clay-like. There was only one place in the village where such soil remained damp even in spring. The Finch estate's private greenhouse path. She noted it quietly. Then there was the photograph. She had said it was taken at her cousin Lydia's garden party in 1904, and indeed it was. The man had carried it folded, preserved. But something gnawed at her, something just beyond the edges of memory. She opened an old album and turned to the same picture. There, barely visible in the corner, stood a tall young man, unassuming, blurred by distance, but somehow familiar. It was not the face that struck her. It was the posture, still, intent. Was it possible that the stranger had known her all those years ago? And if so, why return now? In the quiet of her parlor, Miss Marple sat with her, knitting untouched and her thoughts unusually heavy. The pieces were shifting, slowly, but with purpose. The photograph, the appearance of the stranger in her garden, the hidden mud, the late-night shadow in the study. All suggested not coincidence, but motive. Not malice, perhaps, but need. Desperation, even. She thought of her youth. Dances in borrowed gloves, whispered gossip behind paper fans, the sudden disappearances of friends whose names were never spoken again. One in particular stood out. Lavinia Blackthorne, a bright girl, slightly older, engaged once to a man her family had disapproved of. The engagement was broken, and Lavinia had vanished from polite conversation as if she'd never existed. There were rumors, of course, a quiet departure, a life cut short by shame or scandal, and a man, a suitor, who had once spoken kindly to Jane, then disappeared himself. Could it be? Was the man in her garden Daniel Carradine? A name she had not heard in 40 years. But if it was he, then the photograph was not a clue. It was a memory, one he had kept close, perhaps the only thing he had left. Miss Marple set her teacup down. The past, she knew, was never truly buried, especially not in a village like St. Mary Mead, where every garden, every grave, and every glance held more than it revealed. She rose, not with alarm, but resolve. It was time to go back further than the present, to a secret long thought, forgotten. It was during one of Miss Marple's quiet visits to the vicarage garden, ostensibly to bring lemon sponge for the vicar's tea, that Polly Griggs approached her, with a look that held both guilt and fear. "I wasn't going to say anything, miss," she whispered as they stood by the rhododendrons, out of earshot. "But I saw them, the gentleman who died, and Major Finch." Miss Marple turned slightly. "When was this, dear?" "2 nights before he was found. I'd been fetching kindling for the vicar. It was near dusk, just by the hedge that borders the Finch property. They were arguing." "Arguing?" Miss Marple echoed gently. "What about?" Polly hesitated. "I couldn't hear proper, but the Major was red-faced and shouting. The other man kept his voice low, like he was trying to calm him. But then the Major pushed him hard, and stormed off toward his garden." "And the gentleman?" "He just stood there a moment, then walked away. Looked tired, sad even." Miss Marple placed a gloved hand lightly on the girl's arm. "You were right to tell me." Later that day, when Miss Marple casually mentioned the timing to Inspector Crail, he frowned and made note. "Curious," he murmured. "Major Finch claimed he was in Bath with an old regiment friend that evening." Miss Marple, of course, said nothing, but in her mind the first true crack had appeared in the Major's perfect story. 2 mornings later, a young constable from Much Benham arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, bringing news of a discovery made during further examination of the deceased's belongings. The silver-topped walking stick, which had seemed at first merely ornamental, contained a hidden compartment just below the handle. Inside was a folded photograph, far more recent than the one of young Miss Marple. It showed a girl in uniform, no more than 16. Her expression was solemn, her dark eyes fixed on something beyond the camera's lens. There was no name, no note, just the image. When Miss Marple showed the photograph to Polly Griggs, the reaction was immediate. "Oh no, miss," she said, stepping back. "I've never seen her before." "You're quite sure?" "Yes. She looks like she belongs to another time. Maybe one of those girls from the war, in a training camp." Miss Marple took the photo back, studying it again. It was the sort of face that lingered, familiar yet difficult to place. There was something in the shape of the chin, the arch of the brow. She showed it to Diana Stone the following day. The artist stared at it longer than expected, then shook her head. "I don't know her." But Miss Marple noticed how her fingers trembled slightly when she handed it back. Later she sat by the hearth with her knitting untouched, pondering the meaning of the second photograph. If the first was from a lost romance, perhaps this one spoke of something else entirely. A secret the man had carried it not for sentiment, but for guilt or protection. On a crisp afternoon that carried the faintest smell of wood smoke, Miss Marple happened to pass by the studio cottage where Miss Diana Stone kept to herself most days. As she neared the gate, she noticed a trail of smoke rising more heavily than usual from the chimney. There was nothing unusual in a fire on a brisk spring day, of course. But this smoke was thick, acrid. Paper, not pine. She knocked politely, but no answer came. Only the hiss and crackle from within. After a moment she turned and walked away, her expression unreadable. That evening, under the guise of bringing some fresh preserves to the vicar, Miss Marple passed by again, and noted that the garden gate was unlocked. Just inside the hedgerow, near the stone path, she noticed a faint pile of ashes tucked into the corner of a broken flower bed, likely swept from the hearth. Among the graying remnants, something caught her eye. The charred edge of an envelope. Carefully she retrieved it with her handkerchief. The postmark was still visible. 1943. London. Addressed to someone in St. Mary Mead, though the name had burned away. Miss Marple returned home with the scrap tucked into her gardening apron. She thought again of the second photograph, of Diana's tremble, of the man with his quiet eyes and silver-topped cane. Secrets, she thought, do not burn so easily as paper. They cling, like smoke, to the very air that people breathe, long after the fire has gone out. The confirmation came not from St. Mary Mead, but from London. A telegram arrived at the police station and was quickly relayed to Inspector Crail, who wasted no time in sharing the details with Miss Marple. "The deceased," he said gravely over tea, "has been identified. Daniel Carradine." Miss Marple stirred her cup. "The name sounds vaguely familiar." "It ought to," said Crail. "Carradine was suspected of aiding the enemy during the war. Not formally convicted, mind you. Vanished before the case reached trial. Rumors said he fled to the continent. Others claimed he'd assumed a false identity and disappeared entirely. And yet," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "he returned. Not to London, but here, to St. Mary Mead." Crail nodded. "Odd, isn't it? He had no family here, no recorded connections. Which raises the question, what brought him back?" Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Perhaps not what, Inspector? Whom?" Carradine's history cast a long shadow. During the war, men like him, suspected of divided loyalties, had been judged in both courtrooms and parlors. Whispers carried faster than telegrams, and though decades had passed, the taint of treachery lingered. Miss Marple said little more, but in her eyes the question deepened. Was Daniel Carradine truly a traitor, or simply the scapegoat of someone with more to lose? In a village as tightly woven as St. Mary Mead, scandal was less a ripple than a wildfire. Within days of the name Carradine reaching the public ear, the village was alight with speculation. At the grocer's, Miss Hartnell whispered that the dead man had been a spy. At the post office, Mr. Appleton claimed he'd seen Carradine years ago, lurking near the Finch property. Young Timothy Grant insisted his grandfather once mentioned Carradine in connection with a woman who'd disappeared during the war. The gossip leapt easily from topic to topic: espionage, forbidden love, secret codes, even murder during the blackout years. Mrs. Bantry, never one to resist theatrical flourish, declared over bridge that the man had likely returned to uncover a wartime conspiracy and had been silenced for it. Major Finch, overhearing this, nearly knocked over the card table. It's nonsense, he barked. The war's long over. Digging up bones no one asked to be found. You'll see. This Carradine fellow is probably after money, or revenge. Miss Marple, seated with her knitting as she listened, said nothing. But she took note of the flush that spread across the Major's collar, and how quickly he left the room when the talk turned to Lavinia Blackthorne. The past, it seemed, was not merely a subject of curiosity. It was a source of quiet dread. And in a place like St. Mary Mead, dread had a way of speaking louder than truth. It was over tea with Reverend Phelps that Miss Marple finally gave voice to what had been forming quietly in her mind. "I do wonder," she said, "whether we are not looking in the wrong direction entirely." The vicar looked up from his scone. "You mean Carradine?" "Not him precisely, but the talk of spies and wartime treachery. It feels rather convenient, does it not? Everyone's suddenly an expert on espionage. But I've always found, Vicar, that true danger rarely arrives in such grand fashion." Reverend Phelps nodded slowly. "You suspect something more domestic?" "Precisely," she said. "More intimate. I've lived long enough to know that betrayal doesn't always wear a uniform. It wears a kind smile, a respectable hat, a familiar scent." He looked at her thoughtfully. "Do you believe Carradine was murdered?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she folded her napkin carefully, as though closing the matter. "I believe he came seeking the truth," she said at last. "And I believe someone feared that truth enough to stop him." There was silence for a moment. Then the vicar refilled her teacup, his hand trembling slightly. As the pieces fell into place, Miss Marple found herself growing, quietly, uneasy. Each discovery, the photograph, the hidden compartment, the ash-laced envelope, even Polly's account of the argument, seemed to serve the same narrative. Her returning traitor, an artist with secrets, a frightened servant, a war-torn love affair. It was all too tidy. Miss Marple had long observed that truth, like embroidery, was rarely symmetrical. Real life frayed at the edges, motives tangled, threads twisted. But this tale, it fit together too neatly, too quickly. She opened her notebook once more, glancing at the sketch she had made of the timeline. A question tugged at her, persistent and quiet. Why now? Why had Daniel Carradine returned now, after so many years? Why had he gone first to her garden? Why had he stood so still, looking not at her house, but at her? And why did so many people claim to know so much, yet say so little that was concrete? Miss Marple shut the book softly. She had spent her life among people who whispered behind lace curtains and made accusations over jam jars. She had learned that the loudest voices often belonged to those most eager to misdirect. The truth, she felt certain, lay not in the grand claims or village drama, but in something quieter, older, closer to home. Miss Marple rarely opened the old chest at the foot of her bed. It was filled with fading handkerchiefs, dried lavender sachets, brittle letters tied with ribbon, and beneath them, a photograph album, bound in cracked leather. On this particular morning she opened it deliberately. She turned the pages with care, her fingers pausing now and then over faces, long vanished from the world. Bridesmaids with paper fans, stiff-backed gentlemen in uniform, cousins she'd not thought of in decades. Then she found it. A group photo, taken in the summer of 1939, just before the war. It had been an engagement party, she recalled. Lavinia Blackthorne's engagement, though not, as it turned out, her final one. There were champagne glasses and parasols, and the awkward formality of people pretending to know one another better than they did. And there, standing slightly apart, not arm in arm like the others, was a tall, slim man in a light suit. His features were sharper than in death, but the eyes were unmistakable. Daniel Carradine. He had been introduced to Lavinia as a civil servant, though even then, there had been murmurs of other associations. Miss Marple stared at the image for a long time. The photograph he had carried in his coat had been of her, but he had been there for Lavinia. Perhaps he had confused the two in his old age, or perhaps, just perhaps, it had been Lavinia who had given him the photograph in the first place. And now it seemed he had returned for answers no one had ever dared to give. Miss Marple did not often visit the Blenheim estate. It had a chill about it, not only in temperature but in spirit. Lavinia's elder brother, Ambrose Blackthorne, still lived there, tending what was left of the family's dwindling fortune with stubborn pride and bitter solitude. He received Miss Marple in the library with thin courtesy, and poured her tea as if it were an obligation rather than a kindness. "I'd prefer," he said, "not to rake over the past." "I imagine you would," she replied calmly. "But unfortunately the past seems to have raked its way back into the present, quite without your permission." Ambrose scowled. "This is about Lavinia, I suppose." "She was once very dear to me," said Miss Marple, "and now a man has died, a man who loved her, who may have been the father of her child." Ambrose's teacup rattled. "She was pregnant, wasn't she?" Miss Marple continued. "When she left." "She didn't leave," Ambrose snapped. "She was sent to London to stay with a cousin. There were arrangements. Then, nothing. A telegram saying she had gone. Vanished." "Vanished," Miss Marple echoed. "And no effort was made to find her." Ambrose's jaw tightened. It was wartime. She was disgraced. Our name couldn't endure a scandal. "But it could endure silence," Miss Marple murmured. Ambrose said nothing, but his silence was filled with guilt. Miss Marple stood, her expression as soft as it was unrelenting. "I believe Daniel Carradine came to learn what happened to Lavinia," she said. "And someone was determined that he would not succeed." Miss Marple examined the burnt scrap once more, under the reading lamp in her parlor. It was no ordinary envelope. The paper, though singed, was of wartime rationed stock, thin and fibrous. The faint remains of a return address confirmed it had been sent from London during the early 1940s. She thought again of the ash pile outside Diana Stone's cottage, the scorched remains hidden beneath careless garden debris. There had been no name on the envelope when she found it, but something about the handwriting had tugged at her memory. Later that afternoon she visited Diana under the pretext of returning a borrowed book. The artist seemed nervous, distracted, and reluctant to engage in conversation. But Miss Marple, as always, knew when to press and when to let silence speak. That evening she received a note from Diana. It was written in elegant slanting script, just a few lines folded into a cream envelope. Miss Marple read it once, then again. "I think you would already know what I tried to destroy. You were her friend. I was only her secret. Forgive me for keeping it so long. D.S." Miss Marple opened her drawer and withdrew the scorched envelope. It was addressed to Daniel Carradine, and it had been written by Lavinia Blackthorne. The letter, though damaged, was just legible. "I will come to the garden. Meet me in the place where we last spoke, by the hedge near the old rose bush. I will wear the blue scarf. Forgive me for what they have made me do. Forgive me if I cannot stay." Miss Marple closed the letter with trembling fingers. So Carradine had come, faithful to a promise long faded, and someone, still watching, had feared what would be revealed in that meeting. Miss Marple sat at her bureau with a small notebook open before her, dates jotted in her precise, slanted script, birth records, marriage announcements, obituaries. These, when properly consulted, told stories far more candidly than people did. Diana Stone had arrived in St. Mary Mead 2 months ago, ostensibly to seek quiet and inspiration. She had no known relations, no family ever spoken of. Her birth certificate, if one sought it, would list a mother who died in childbirth, a woman by the name of Harriet Stone. But no such woman had lived in the district. Miss Marple, however, recalled a discreet notice in the parish ledger from 1944. An unnamed infant christened quietly in the vicarage, with no mother present. The child had been taken in by a couple from Yorkshire, friends of the Blackthorne family. She then turned to a painting Diana had left uncovered during their last conversation. A portrait of a woman, young, fragile, with the same storm-gray eyes. It was Lavinia. Or rather, someone who might never have known Lavinia but had seen her features in the mirror each morning. The truth settled like a final stitch pulled tight. Diana was not just Lavinia's daughter. She was the living legacy of a scandal carefully erased. The child whose existence had been denied so thoroughly, even she did not fully understand it, until Daniel Carradine came back to find her. In the quiet hush of her parlor, Miss Marple laid it all out, not aloud, not yet, but in the chambers of her mind, where the threads of life wove into meaning. Daniel Carradine had been Lavinia's intended. Whether they had ever formally wed remained unclear, but their bond had been real. When Lavinia became pregnant during the war, her family had acted swiftly, sending her away, burying the scandal beneath carefully arranged absences and sudden telegrams. Lavinia had died, perhaps in childbirth. That part, Miss Marple suspected, had been true. But the child had lived, adopted, renamed and raised far from the whispers of St. Mary Mead. Diana had grown up as an artist, never told the full truth. Yet something in her had pulled her back to the village where her life had begun. Carradine had spent decades in exile, marked by suspicion and silence. But he had returned, old, ill perhaps, but determined to learn what had become of Lavinia and the child they had created together. His photograph of Miss Marple, then, was not meant as a memento of affection. It was a breadcrumb, a clue to trace Lavinia's past through a friend who had known her best. He had visited the vicarage to look at the records. He had walked the village, watched the houses, studied the faces. And someone had watched him, someone with much to lose. If the past became present, Carradine had come seeking peace. Instead, he found silence and death. Miss Marple had long observed that villages, like people, had memories. But where people remembered with pain or affection, villages remembered with caution. They preserved what was convenient and quietly ignored what was not. So it was no surprise to her that someone, perhaps more than one, had taken great care to ensure that Daniel Carradine's return led not to revelation, but ruin. She recalled Polly's frightened whisper of seeing someone in the study, the Major's discomfort when Lavinia's name surfaced, Diana's trembling hand upon seeing the photograph of a girl in uniform. And then there was the scorched envelope, burned not in haste, but deliberately, as though it were the last fragile link to a truth too dangerous to keep. Someone had known from the moment Carradine returned that his presence threatened to unearth a secret long buried, that Lavinia had not vanished into shame, but had left behind a daughter, and that daughter had returned, a daughter whose very existence could unravel reputations, disturb carefully protected lies, and call into question the past of those now respected. Miss Marple stood in her garden, gazing toward the hedge where the stranger had once stood. He came, she said quietly, to uncover the past. And someone else, perhaps fearing disgrace, had made certain that the past stayed dead. But the truth, she knew, was never so obliging. It always found its way. Through old letters, half-burnt photographs, or the quiet, persistent eyes of a stranger in a garden. In the end, it wasn't hatred that had killed Daniel Carradine. It was fear. Not the fear of violence or revenge, but of revelation, of a carefully constructed life torn apart by the return of one truth, too many. Miss Marple had seen it often enough. The respectable facade of a person built atop the quiet bones of youth, mistakes, and moments best forgotten. Major Finch, with his clipped tones and overgrown pride, had a stake in the silence. Lavinia had been his cousin. Some said more than that. A secret wartime affair was plausible. A child, even more so. And if that child had grown into Diana Stone, returned to the village, and unknowingly brought with her the potential to disgrace a man who had spent decades building a spotless reputation, well, that was motive enough, especially if Carradine had come to reveal her heritage, especially if, in his quiet, steadfast way, he had threatened to tell the truth. Miss Marple folded her hands. The web had been stitched long ago, not in malice, but in fear of what people might say. But like all webs, it had eventually begun to catch its maker. It was a late afternoon, and the air carried a hush peculiar to revelations. At Blenheim Cottage, the tea had been set out with polished formality. Sugar tongs, cream jug, a plate of Dundee cake. But it was not comfort Miss Marple offered. It was resolution. She had invited just a handful of people, enough to stir attention, but not so many as to raise alarm. Major Finch arrived stiffly, his mustache bristling with suspicion. Diana Stone came pale but composed, eyes shaded with something deeper than worry. Polly Griggs, wringing her hands, hovered by the sideboard. Inspector Crail stood near the window, notebook at the ready but unspeaking. For this was not his moment. Miss Marple, seated with unshakable serenity, poured the tea herself. "I do thank you all for coming," she began in her usual gentle tones. "I thought it best to gather everyone one together, as I believe we now have all the answers needed, though not the ones we may have expected." Major Finch made a noise of polite irritation. "If this is about that Carradine fellow—" "It is," Miss Marple said evenly, "though not in the way you imagine." She set down her cup with care. "For what we are dealing with, my dear Major, is not espionage or blackmail. It is something far older, and far more dangerous." The room quieted. Only the clock ticked on. "It is about love, shame, and the very human desire," she said, "to hide from our own pasts." Miss Marple turned to Diana, her gaze soft but unwavering. "Daniel Carradine did not come to St. Mary Mead seeking revenge, nor money. He came for answers. For a truth denied him since the spring of 1944. She paused, her voice even. "He came to find Lavinia Blackthorne." A silence fell. Diana's eyes widened, and Polly let out a quiet gasp. Miss Marple continued. "You see, Carradine and Lavinia were engaged, or very nearly. Their relationship was never formally acknowledged, as certain members of the family found it unsuitable." Her eyes briefly flicked toward Major Finch. "When Lavinia fell pregnant, she was sent away. Carradine was never informed. Letters were intercepted. Decisions were made. And Lavinia, though she died shortly after childbirth, managed to send one final letter, asking him to meet her here, in the garden." Diana's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "The hedge. By the rose bush." "Indeed." Miss Marple nodded. She had hoped to see him one last time, but he never received that letter. She folded her hands. "It was destroyed, or hidden. by someone who feared what might come of the truth. Carradine had spent the decades since under suspicion, marked by a war that also took the woman he loved. And yet, in the end, he returned, not to clear his name but to trace her memory, to know what had become of the child they had created together. Miss Marple turned once more to Diana. And he found her, though not by design. Miss Marple's expression grew graver. Of course, such matters rarely exist in a vacuum. The question becomes, why was all of this so carefully hidden? Who stood to lose the most if Carradine succeeded in his search? She looked to Major Finch. Lavinia was your cousin. But the connection ran deeper than blood, didn't it? Finch stiffened. I won't listen to this nonsense. But Miss Marple pressed gently, relentlessly. She was also your lover. It may have begun innocently, as wartime affairs often did, but the result was quite permanent. Diana turned toward the Major, stricken. You. Miss Marple nodded. You are not only Lavinia's daughter, you are Major Finch's. Finch's face had gone a mottled red. You have no proof. I have enough, Miss Marple said, unshaken. Records sealed, names falsified, an adoption arranged through friends of the Blackthorn family. People with just enough influence to smooth such matters over quietly. She paused. And who else would benefit from ensuring Carradine never uncovered the truth? Finch rose abruptly. You're accusing me of murder. I am suggesting, Miss Marple said coolly, that Carradine's return threatened to expose your past, a past you have worked tirelessly to obscure, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of what your name might become, of what people would say. The Major sank back into his chair, breathing heavily. No one spoke. Outside, the first evening birds began to call. Inside, a silence fell as deep as the one Daniel Carradine had carried with him for over 40 years. Miss Marple looked slowly from face to face before her voice resumed, steady and clear. I believe the final meeting between Major Finch and Daniel Carradine took place 2 evenings before the body was found. A reconciliation of sorts, at least on the surface. Mr. Carradine had been seen by Polly near the hedge that borders the Finch property. He had not come to accuse, but to speak. She turned to Finch. You offered him brandy. A gesture of peace, perhaps, or a final distraction. The Major's jaw clenched. You shared a glass by the garden wall, somewhere near your private greenhouse. You assured him you bore no ill will, but your glass was untouched. Finch's hands were still now, gripping the chair's arms. Miss Marple continued with quiet gravity. You laced his drink with aconitine, easily derived from monkshood, which you've cultivated in your garden beds for years. A single dose, masked by brandy's warmth, would leave little trace, save for paralysis and death within the hour. There was a long pause. And then, she added, you returned to your house. Calm, certain. You told no one of the meeting. You presumed the village would forget Carradine soon enough. After all, what was he but an old ghost stirring up forgotten scandal? Miss Marple's eyes held his. But ghosts, Major Finch, have a way of returning, especially when they seek justice. Inspector Crail cleared his throat. We had wondered about the mud on the victim's boots. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, a small thing and so often overlooked. But details are rarely meaningless. She leaned forward slightly, as if addressing a classroom rather than a parlor. You see, the mud on Carradine's boots was not the sandy, crumbly type you'd find in the churchyard, nor the chalky dryness of my own rose beds. It was deep brown, clay-heavy, and fresh. She looked at Finch. The very type that's found along the path beside your greenhouse, especially after you've watered the plants. Carradine's boots were clean that morning in my garden. Yet by the time he was found, they were caked in that specific soil. Inspector Crale made a note without speaking. Miss Marple continued gently. It was not a complicated deduction. He had met you there, walked beside your greenhouse, glass in hand. It was the last thing he did. Finch remained motionless, though a muscle in his cheek twitched. To a man burdened by memory, it must have seemed fitting to die near the very garden where love had once bloomed, and betrayal had first taken root. But poisoning alone, said Miss Marple, would not have sufficed, not for a man such as yourself. She turned back to the assembled group, her voice gentle but firm. You needed to ensure that suspicion fell elsewhere. She opened a small envelope from the table beside her. This note was found by the vicar's maid, slipped into the study drawer. It warned of blackmail, that Carradine had threatened to expose someone. It was unsigned and conveniently timed to appear just after his death. She tapped the paper. But the ink had not fully dried when Polly discovered it. Her small blot near the signature line was proof enough. Inspector Crale glanced at Finch. We compared the handwriting. It matched your gardening journal. Miss Marple finished. Same looping F, same curious tail on the capital B. Finch shifted but said nothing. Miss Marple continued. And the missing bottle of plant tonic, the one stored near the monk's hood roots, was found behind your garden wall. Planted, no doubt, to be found later, and confirm a theory of blackmail. She tilted her head. A theory, I might add, that you very much wanted to become fact. And yet, she added softly, the truth, like spring bulbs, has a tendency to rise, even from the darkest soil. Miss Marple's voice gentled once more as she turned to the last revelation. There is one more thread, she said, though it may wound more than any poison. She turned to Polly, who stood trembling at the edge of the room. My dear, you spoke the truth when you said you did not know your parents. You were told your mother died shortly after your birth, and that your father was never named. Polly blinked, clearly confused. Yes, miss. I was raised at the home in Chichester. The vicar helped me find work here. I've never known more than that. Miss Marple's eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and resolve, turned once more to Finch. But you knew, didn't you, Major? You arranged her placement here. You kept watch from afar. I imagine in some tortured corner of your conscience, you even felt it a kindness, bringing her close, without revealing the truth. She paused. But secrets have a way of demanding their reckoning. Finch finally looked at Polly. His face, always firm and composed, crumpled into something frail and broken. I couldn't. They'd have known. About Lavinia. About me. Everything I worked for. All those years. And so, Miss Marple said softly, you buried one truth to protect another. Not realizing, of course, that the daughter you feared would expose you had already been standing beside you. Kind, loyal, unknowing. The silence was unbearable. Then Polly, pale and stunned, stepped back. Miss Marple folded her hands once more. The greatest irony, Major Finch, is that you sought to protect your name from disgrace, and in doing so, destroyed the one person who had come not to ruin you, but to remember someone both of you had loved. Major Finch did not speak as Inspector Crale stepped forward to formally place him under arrest. There was no final protest, no shouted denial, only a hollow silence, the collapse of a man not with rage, but with resignation. His once rigid shoulders sagged. His eyes, so often filled with proud indignation, now seemed distant, haunted by what might have been spared had honesty come sooner. He allowed himself to be led from Blenheim Cottage with the dignity of a soldier and the fragility of a man undone. Outside, the villagers stood quietly, many unaware of the full truth, all sensing that something irrevocable had ended. Miss Marple watched from her parlor, neither triumphant nor cruel. She had seen too many men fall, not to bullets or scandal but to the unbearable weight of secrets kept too long. The sins of youth, she knew, often wore the clothes of honor when they matured, and when stripped away, left only sorrow in their place. Carradine had come seeking memory. Finch had met him with fear, and now justice had quietly claimed them both. Diana remained in St. Mary Mead. There were officers, of course, friends in London, a gallery in Bath willing to take her work. But she declined them all, choosing instead the cottage by the vicarage, where the garden still carried the scent of the past. She painted in silence, the figures on her canvas slowly changing. The spectral women of her earlier work softened. Their eyes were no longer turned away but forward. Their hands held something real. Roses, letters, teacups, memory. One day she brought Miss Marple a small painting wrapped in brown paper. It was of a girl in wartime uniform, standing near the hedge in Miss Marple's garden. Carradine's second photograph come to life. "I think," Diana said quietly. She was waiting for him all along. Miss Marple accepted the gift without a word. No grand gesture, no legal claim. But Diana's inheritance was clear, not in wealth but in truth, the knowledge of who she was and who had loved her into being. And sometimes, Miss Marple thought, that was the most difficult inheritance of all. A few days later, as the first blush of lilac returned to the hedgerows, Miss Marple sat with Reverend Phelps in the vicarage garden. Their tea cooled between them as they talked, not of the crime itself, but of the ripples left in its wake. "So many years," the vicar murmured, "and yet it came back so swiftly, so suddenly." Miss Marple nodded. "Time does not bury as deeply as we'd like. We are not made to forget, only to look away." He sighed. "I keep thinking of Lavinia. All the years she was simply not spoken of." "She was not forgotten," Miss Marple replied gently, "only silenced, as women often are." They sat for a moment in companionable quiet. "And Carradine?" he asked at last. Miss Marple poured another cup. "He came not to punish but to remember. That, I think, was the difference. And perhaps," she added softly, "that is what frightened the Major most of all." The vicar gave a grave nod. Miss Marple reached for her teacup. "It is a strange thing," she said, "how gardens hold so much life and yet so many ghosts." In the weeks that followed, the village quiet returned, as it always did. Gossip dulled into habit. Scandal faded into whisper, and the garden at Blenheim Cottage bloomed once more, as if death had not stood within its hedgerows. Miss Marple pruned her roses carefully, her movements precise, her gaze never far from the hedge where Daniel Carradine had once stood. Polly continued at the vicarage, quieter perhaps but steadier. Diana painted in the mornings, her windows open to the breeze. And Miss Marple resumed her walking circuit of the village, gathering news, offering shortbread, noticing the unnoticed. But the garden, though serene, was not the same. It had seen too much, and Miss Marple, ever observant, knew the truth of it. Evil did not always wear a mask or announce its arrival. Sometimes it came quietly, dressed in respectability, armed not with weapons but with shame. And just as often, goodness came in the same guise, soft-footed, steadfast, seeking no credit. As she clipped a fading bloom, she murmured to herself, her garden, like a conscience, must be tended, or else the weeds return. And with that, She turned back toward the cottage where the kettle would soon be whistling. And peace, for now, was restored. Sometimes the dead don't return to haunt us. They come to remind us. In this tale, Daniel Carradine wasn't a villain, but a man carrying the weight of love, betrayal, and 40 years of unanswered questions. He walked back into St. Mary Mead, not for vengeance, but for truth. And in doing so, he unearthed a past that many had tried to bury, under silence and shame. Miss Marple, with her quiet brilliance and unfailing intuition, reminded us of something important, that the truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through scorched letters, mismatched soil, and the tremble of a teacup. And perhaps most haunting of all, those who spent their lives guarding their reputation were undone by the very love they tried to conceal. In the end, justice was served, but not in a dramatic courtroom or with fanfare.